that has adequate prey, adequate cover, and no other mountain lions to compete with. The straightforward biological prediction is that he would stop dispersing. He would establish a territory. He would begin attempting to breed. For that prediction to produce a resident breeding population, he would need to find a female. And this is where the official framework becomes somewhat uncomfortable, because female mountain lions do not disperse, not to the extent males do. Their home ranges are smaller, their movements less dramatic, their dispersal distances measured in dozens rather than hundreds of kilometers. The presence of a lone male tells you almost nothing about whether females are present. The absence of confirmed females does not mean they are absent. It means they have not been confirmed, which in a landscape as vast and as unmonitored as rural northern New England is a meaningfully different statement. Maine alone covers more than 35,000 square kilometers of commercially managed forest land in its northern interior, where systematic wildlife monitoring is essentially non-existent. The state has no mountain lion management program. It has no camera trap network oriented toward detecting cryptic large felids in remote areas. It has hunting pressure during specific seasons that produces some incidental observation data and very little else across 11 months of the year. A mountain lion moving through the commercial forest region of Maine's North Woods could travel for weeks without encountering a human being. In those conditions, a failure to confirm is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a monitoring gap. The tracks are what deserve particular attention, because they are the category of evidence that is hardest to dismiss and hardest to confirm. And the tension between those two facts captures something essential about the entire situation. Mountain lion tracks are distinctive. The paw print of an adult male is roughly 10 to 13 centimeters in diameter, substantially larger than the largest bobcat track, and shaped differently, with a leading lobe on the central pad that creates a characteristic asymmetry visible to experienced trackers. The track shows 4 toes without claw marks, because mountain lions, like all felids except cheetahs, walk with retracted claws. The stride pattern and trail width are diagnostic for someone who has seen enough of them. In the winter of 2021, a registered Maine guide named Dennis Folsom was leading a snowshoe trip in the Moosehead Lake region when he came across a set of tracks in fresh snow that he described in a written report to the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife as the largest cat track he had ever encountered in 31 years of working in that terrain. He photographed the tracks, he measured the stride length, he followed the trail for approximately 2 kilometers before it entered a dense spruce thicket and became impossible to follow without disturbing it. The department reviewed the photographs. Their response, according to Folsom, was that the images were consistent with a large bobcat. Folsom's response to that assessment was unprintable. He has spent 3 decades distinguishing animals by their tracks. He knows what a large bobcat looks like. He said the comparison was not even close. This dynamic, the credible observer presenting compelling field evidence and receiving an institutional response that explains it away without field investigation, recurs across the New England sighting record with remarkable consistency. It is not unique to mountain lions. It is the predictable product of a bureaucratic posture in which the cost of acknowledging a controversial possibility is higher than the cost of declining to investigate it. State wildlife agencies have limited resources, complex political environments, and constituencies that include both hunters who would welcome a mountain lion recovery and farmers who would not. The safer institutional path is consistent skepticism. The problem with that path is that it produces a systematic bias against confirmation, regardless of evidence quality. If the bar for confirmation requires a physical specimen or an exceptionally clear photograph, and no systematic effort is made to obtain either, the confirmation rate will remain 0 indefinitely. The absence of confirmation then gets recycled as evidence that the animal is not there, which justifies continued non-investigation. The circularity of this reasoning is not subtle once you see it. New Hampshire presents a case study in how this dynamic operates in practice. The state's Fish and Game Department maintains an official position that mountain lions are not present in New Hampshire and that any reported sightings represent escaped captive animals, misidentified native species, or observer error. That position has been consistent for decades. It has also been maintained against a growing body of submitted evidence that the department has declined to systematically evaluate. Between 2018 and 2022, the department received 73 mountain lion reports from residents across the state. Of those, 12 included photographic or track evidence that the submitters described as clear enough to warrant field investigation. In each case, the department's response was a form letter explaining the official position and listing common animals that are sometimes confused with mountain lions. No field investigation was conducted for any of the 12 cases. This is not a criticism of individual wildlife officers, many of whom privately express more uncertainty than their institutional communications suggest. It is a description of how bureaucratic risk management shapes scientific inquiry in ways that produce systematic blind spots. The question of what a mountain lion would actually be doing in New England, if any are present, is worth thinking through carefully because it shapes everything about what the evidence base should look like. A lone dispersing male, which is the most parsimonious explanation for any individual sighting, behaves very differently from an established resident. He is moving. His territory is not fixed. He is not returning to the same kill sites, the same resting areas, the same water sources on a predictable schedule. He is covering large distances, potentially 20 to 30 kilometers a night, feeding opportunistically on deer, beaver, porcupine, and whatever else presents itself. The kills are distributed across a vast area. The scat is scattered. The tracks appear in one watershed and then not again. This is the signature not of an established population, but of an animal in transit, and it is exactly the kind of presence that produces intermittent credible sightings, with no physical evidence accumulation in any one location. The absence of a kill cache, a den site, or a concentrated scat deposit is not inconsistent with the presence of a transient animal. It is precisely what a transient animal's presence looks like. The prey dynamics of modern New England are worth dwelling on because they represent one of the most significant ecological changes in the region's recent history, and they bear directly on the plausibility question. White-tailed deer populations across New England have expanded dramatically since the mid-20th century. Vermont's deer herd, estimated at fewer than 50,000 animals in the 1970s, now stands at roughly 150,000. New Hampshire's population has grown similarly. Maine's deer herd, while subject to more variability due to harsh winters, supports a population of approximately 250,000 animals. This is more deer than New England has supported at any point in the past 2 centuries. They are everywhere. They are in suburban backyards, in agricultural margins, in the deep forest interior, and along every major river drainage in the region. For a large predator that specializes in ambushing deer, this landscape is not marginal habitat. It is exceptional habitat. The prey availability that would have been insufficient to support a mountain lion population in 1950 is more than sufficient today. The limiting factor is not food. The limiting factor is, apparently, the animals themselves. There is a category of sighting that appears repeatedly in the New England record that deserves special attention, not because it is more credible than others, but because it is more specific in ways that are difficult to explain through misidentification. Multiple observers across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine have described seeing a large tawny cat accompanied by cubs, not one animal, a female with offspring. These reports, if accurate, describe something that escaped captive animals and lone dispersing males cannot explain. A breeding female with cubs represents an established resident. It represents, if the cubs are genuinely young of the year, a successful reproduction event in New England. The Cougar Network has collected 7 such accounts from the region since 2015. All 7 were submitted by observers who described clear, sustained sightings under adequate light conditions. All 7 involved animals that the observers confidently described as a female, with 1 to 3 young animals following close behind. None were confirmed. All were explained away. But 7 accounts of a female with cubs, spread across 3 states and 8 years, is a pattern. Patterns deserve investigation. The investigation has not happened. The genetic question sits underneath all of this and provides the most intriguing and least discussed dimension of the entire debate. Mountain lions vanished from the eastern United States, beginning in the 1700s, as European settlement pushed westward, and the bounty hunting system systematically eliminated apex predators across the continent. By 1900, they were functionally absent from east of the Mississippi. By 1950, the Florida panther was the only confirmed remnant eastern population, reduced to fewer than 30 individuals, clinging to survival in the Big Cypress Swamp. The Florida panther is now known to be genetically distinct from western mountain lions, representing a lineage that was isolated long enough to develop unique alleles at multiple loci. The question that has never been definitively answered is whether any other isolated eastern lineage survived into the modern period in the remote forests of northern New England and Atlantic Canada, reproducing at densities too low to accumulate confirmation-grade evidence, but high enough to maintain a functional population across decades. The scientific consensus says no. The scientific consensus is based on the absence of confirmed specimens, which is itself a product of the monitoring gap described earlier. A population too sparse to leave abundant physical evidence is also too sparse to easily confirm. The two conditions, sparse population and lack of confirmation, are not independent. They produce each other. Genetic analysis of any confirmed mountain lion specimen from New England would resolve the question of origin with precision that visual observation cannot approach. It would distinguish between a dispersing western male, a released captive animal of western stock, and a hypothetical native eastern lineage in one analysis. The analysis is straightforward. It requires a specimen, which requires confirmation, which requires the kind of sustained investigative effort that has not been allocated. The logic is circular, and the circle is tight. The account that sits most uncomfortably in the skeptical framework comes from a former Vermont state game warden named Carl Hewitt, who retired after 26 years of service and published a detailed written account of his experiences in a small regional hunting magazine in 2020. Hewitt described 3 separate encounters over his career in which he was confident he was seeing mountain lions. The first was in 1998, in the Northeast Kingdom region near the Canadian border, when he observed a large, tawny animal crossing a logging road approximately 80 meters ahead of his truck, at midday, under clear conditions. He watched it for an estimated 12 seconds before it entered the tree line. He described it in his report at the time as almost certainly a mountain lion, and was told by his supervisor to change the language to possible large domestic cat. He changed the language. The second encounter, in 2007, involved tracks in fresh snow in Windsor County that he followed for over a kilometer before they crossed a frozen beaver pond and disappeared into spruce. He photographed the tracks. He submitted the photographs. He was told they were inconclusive. The third encounter, in 2015, involved a visual observation of a tawny animal with a long tail resting on a granite ledge above a hiking trail in the Green Mountain National Forest. He was approximately 60 meters away. He had binoculars. He watched the animal for over a minute before it rose, stretched in the manner of a large cat, and moved along the ledge and out of sight. He did not file a report for that one. He knew what would happen to it. Hewitt is not an excitable amateur. He is a trained observer with a professional background in wildlife identification who spent 26 years in Vermont's forests and knows the fauna of the region with the kind of intimacy that only comes from decades of daily engagement. His account is not proof, it is testimony. But testimony from a witness of this caliber, describing 3 independent encounters over a 17-year period, is not nothing. It is the kind of evidence that, in any other investigative context, would generate a serious and sustained response. The Canadian dimension of the New England mountain lion question is less often discussed than it should be. The province of Quebec, which shares a long border with Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, has its own parallel record of mountain lion sightings that Quebec wildlife authorities have handled with a somewhat different posture than their American counterparts. Between 2012 and 2021, the Ministère des Forêts, de la Faune et des Parcs received 208 mountain lion reports from Quebec residents. Of those, researchers at Université du Québec conducted a formal analysis that screened for credibility using a structured protocol. They identified 38 reports that met their criteria for serious consideration. Their published conclusion, released in 2022, was carefully phrased, but notably different in tone from American agency statements. They wrote that while no specimen had been confirmed, the cumulative pattern of credible reports from the forested regions of southern Quebec was consistent with the presence of at least occasional large felid visitors from either the western dispersal population or from a small remnant population whose status could not be determined without direct investigation. That is not confirmation, but it is a long way from the form letter that New Hampshire sends to people who submit photographic evidence. The Atlantic Canada situation adds another layer. New Brunswick, which borders Maine, has been receiving mountain lion reports since the 1970s, with enough consistency that the province's Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development maintains a database specifically for large cat observations. Nova Scotia has a similar database. Prince Edward Island, being an island, is presumably exempt from the concern. The Maritime Province's approach to these reports is not substantially more confirmatory than their American neighbors, but the institutional acknowledgement that the reports exist and deserve systematic collection represents a different baseline than the posture taken by most New England states. The continuity of the forested landscape across the international border in the northeast means that any population, resident or transient, would not recognize the distinction between Quebec and Vermont, or between New Brunswick and Maine. The ecosystem does not end at the customs checkpoint. If mountain lions are moving through the Canadian side of the border forest, which the Quebec data suggests is at least plausible, they are using the same continuous habitat system that extends deep into northern New England. Winter behavior is a particular focus of interest in the New England mountain lion question because it is when tracks are most likely to be legible and when the animal's movements leave the most interpretable evidence. Mountain lions in their western range are not migratory. They do not hibernate. They remain active through the winter and adjust their prey selection seasonally, taking more deer and elk during periods of deep snow when ungulates are impaired in their movement. In a New England winter, a mountain lion in appropriate habitat would have access to concentrated deer populations in lowland areas where snowpack is manageable, abundant snowshoe hare populations in the boreal transition zone, and beaver cached in ice-covered ponds, accessible through the entry holes that beavers maintain through even severe winters. The prey availability in a New England winter is not an obstacle to survival. Deep snow would actually favor a large predator over its deer prey, as it does across the western mountain lion range. The winter conditions that might seem like a barrier to an animal unfamiliar with them are, for an animal adapted to the pursuit of snow-impaired prey, an advantage. There is no compelling physiological or ecological reason that a mountain lion could not survive a New England winter. The question is whether any are there to try. The media coverage of New England mountain lion sightings follows a predictable and somewhat dispiriting pattern. A credible sighting occurs. Local news covers it. The State Wildlife Agency is contacted for comment. The agency provides the standard response about escaped captives and misidentified bobcats. The story ends. No follow-up investigation is reported because no follow-up investigation occurs. The next credible sighting happens 6 months later, and the cycle repeats. The cumulative effect of this pattern is that individual sightings get covered and individually explained away, while the aggregate pattern, dozens of credible accounts from experienced observers distributed across the region over years, never gets evaluated as a pattern. The ecology of media coverage of this story mirrors the ecology of the official institutional response. Each incident is treated in isolation because treating it as part of a series raises questions that are more complicated to address than any individual report. The aggregate picture is the one that demands an answer. The aggregate picture is the one that receives the least attention. What would it actually take to resolve this question? The question is not rhetorical. It has a specific technical answer. A systematic camera trap deployment across the most frequently reported areas of New England, using the density and placement protocols that have been used to survey other cryptic large felid populations in difficult terrain, combined with a formal scat collection and genetic analysis program, would either confirm the presence of mountain lions or generate an evidence base robust enough to sustain a genuinely confident negative conclusion. The cost of such a program, scaled to cover even the highest priority areas in Vermont and New Hampshire, has been estimated at roughly $2 to $3 million over a 3-year deployment period. That is approximately the cost of 2 or 3 miles of interstate highway resurfacing. It is a tractable number. It has not been allocated. The reason it has not been allocated is not scientific. It is political and institutional. Confirming the presence of mountain lions in New England would trigger a cascade of management obligations, land use conflicts, livestock protection debates, hunting regulation questions, and public safety communications that state wildlife agencies currently do not have the staffing, budget, or political mandate to manage. The cost of not knowing is invisible. The cost of knowing is concrete and immediate. In that environment, not knowing is the path of least resistance, and paths of least resistance tend to persist. The Florida panther story is relevant here as an illustration of what happens when this path of least resistance is abandoned, either because the political environment shifts or because the evidence becomes undeniable. In the 1980s, the Florida panther was confirmed to be critically endangered, reduced to a small, genetically compromised population in the southern tip of the Florida Peninsula. The confirmation of that status triggered a recovery program that has been scientifically controversial, legally complex, and politically contentious every single year since it began. It has also worked. The Florida panther population has grown from fewer than 30 individuals to between 120 and 230 animals, depending on methodology and year. The recovery required federal intervention, decades of land acquisition, highway crossing construction, livestock depredation compensation programs, and sustained political will in the face of consistent opposition from development interests. It was not easy. It was not cheap. It was, by every measurable ecological standard, successful. The New England situation, if mountain lions are genuinely re-establishing themselves, would require a similar response. The similarity of the required response is probably not unrelated to the consistency of the institutional reluctance to confirm the premise. The individual accounts accumulate in ways that resist easy dismissal when they are read in sequence rather than in isolation. A retired schoolteacher in Peacham, Vermont, who photographed a large, tawny animal crossing her back field at dawn and described it with the kind of precise observational detail that comes from a lifetime of birdwatching. A professional forester in Coos County, New Hampshire, who found a deer kill cached under pine branches in a manner he had seen described in mountain lion literature, but never in any other New England predator's behavior. A wildlife photographer in Piscataquis County, Maine, who encountered a fresh set of large felled tracks on a February morning and followed them for 4 hours before the trail entered a frozen lake and the tracks continued across the ice with a stride length and gait pattern that she documented in photographs sent to 3 independent trackers, 2 of whom assessed them as consistent with mountain lion, and 1 of whom declined to make a determination from photographs alone. These are not credulous people. They are not seeing what they want to see. They are people with extensive field experience in the relevant terrain who encountered something they could not explain within the framework of the species that are supposed to be there, and who are reporting it carefully and honestly and being systematically not heard. The bobcat is worth addressing directly because it is the reflexive alternative explanation, and because understanding its limitations as an explanation illuminates something important about the sighting record. The bobcat, Lynx rufus, is unquestionably present across New England in large and growing numbers. It is a successful and expanding species that has benefited from the same forest recovery that has transformed the region's landscape. An adult male bobcat in excellent condition might reach 18 to 20 kilograms, which is substantial for a bobcat, but small relative to an adult male mountain lion, which can reach 100 kilograms in the Northeast. The size difference is not subtle. It is comparable to the difference between a large dog and a small horse. An experienced observer with an adequate sighting duration does not confuse them. The tail length is diagnostic at any distance at which the body size is apparent. Bobcat tails are 10 to 20 centimeters long. Mountain lion tails are 60 to 90 centimeters long and thick at the base. They are different shapes, different proportions, different animals. The reflexive invocation of bobcat as an explanation for every mountain lion report represents a failure to take seriously the observational competence of the people making those reports. Many of these observers have seen bobcats. Many of them have been seeing bobcats for decades. They know what a bobcat looks like. They are not filing reports about bobcats. They are filing reports because they saw something that is not a bobcat and they do not know what else to do with the information. The rewilding framework that has gained significant traction in North American conservation policy over the past decade provides an important context for thinking about the mountain lion question in New England. The rewilding premise, supported by a substantial and growing body of ecological research, holds that the recovery of apex predator populations produces cascading benefits throughout the ecosystems they occupy through a mechanism called trophic cascade. In the most famous documented example, the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 1995 produced measurable changes in elk behavior, vegetation recovery along riverbanks, beaver population dynamics, and ultimately river channel morphology, all linked through a chain of ecological interactions set in motion by the presence of a predator at the top of the food web. The mechanism is not restricted to wolves. Mountain lions have been shown to produce similar cascade effects in their western range, with documented impacts on deer browsing pressure, riparian vegetation recovery, and songbird diversity in habitats where lion presence changed ungulate movement patterns. New England, with its vast forest, its abundant deer, and its compromised riparian systems in some areas due to overgrazing by ungulates freed from predation pressure, is precisely the kind of landscape where those cascade effects would be most ecologically significant. If mountain lions are returning to New England on their own, they are doing something that a growing body of conservation science suggests the ecosystem needs. This does not confirm their presence, but it raises the cost of the institutional posture that declines to find out. The winter of 2022 to 2023 was notable in New England for a series of sighting reports that were unusual not in their individual character, but in their concentration within a short period. Between November 2022 and February 2023, wildlife officers in 3 Vermont counties received a total of 9 reports from 11 separate observers, several of whom did not know each other and were reporting from different locations within a geographic area of roughly 2,400 square kilometers in the central part of the state. The reports varied in detail but were consistent in their broad description of a large, tawny, long-tailed cat. 3 of the reports included photographic evidence submitted with the account. All 3 photographs were assessed by the department as insufficient for definitive identification. No field investigation was initiated. The concentration of reports over a short period from a defined geographic area is the kind of signal that, in the context of any other wildlife species, would trigger a systematic response. A concentration of rabies reports from a defined area would trigger immediate field investigation. A concentration of unusual deer mortality from a defined area would trigger a diagnostic workup. A concentration of credible large felid observations from a defined area triggers a form letter. The asymmetry is notable. What those 11 observers saw in Vermont over those 4 months remains unknown. The photographs are sitting in a state database that no one is analyzing. The tracks have melted, the landscape has returned to its ordinary inscrutable winter face, offering nothing to those who are not looking and giving very little to those who are. The deer are moving through the same drainages they have always used. The forests are the same dark spruce and northern hardwood mix they have been for a century. Whatever was there, or is there, is doing what apex predators do, which is remain largely invisible to a landscape that has not evolved the infrastructure to see it. The argument from silence that state agencies rely on is worth examining one final time with the precision it deserves. The argument is that, if mountain lions were present in New England, we would have more and better evidence of them by now. The counter to that argument is not that the evidence is adequate as it stands. It is that the expected evidence yield from a sparse, transient, or recently establishing population monitored by no dedicated program in a landscape of millions of hectares of largely unmonitored forest is not meaningfully different from zero. The gap between a population that does not exist and a population that exists at very low density and is not being looked for is, from an evidence production standpoint, essentially invisible. You cannot distinguish between the two conditions without looking, and looking requires making a decision that the question is worth investigating, which requires an institutional willingness to take seriously the possibility that the answer might be yes. That willingness has not materialized. The question remains open in the way that questions remain open when no one is asking them loudly enough, with enough resources, for long enough. Somewhere in the hills of Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, in the northern reaches of New Hampshire's White Mountain Forest, in the commercial timber country of Maine's unorganized territories, the woods are doing what woods do. Deer are moving through the lowlands. Beaver are maintaining their ponds under the ice. Snowshoe hare are leaving their tracks in the powder snow along the older margins. And something, possibly, is watching them. The reports say so. The biology says it is possible. The landscape says it is ready. The institutions say they do not know, which is a different thing from saying it is not happening. And the difference between those two statements is the size of the question that nobody in an official position has yet been willing to fully confront. The tracks keep appearing. The witnesses keep coming forward. The form letters keep going out. And the forests of New England, darker and deeper and wilder than they have been in more than 100 years, keep their answers to themselves.